India's green energy push and the big push for net zero emissions by 2070. Well, at the National Council meeting, the Prime Minister said that India is right on track as far as its target of net zero emissions by 2070 is concerned. But we take a deep dive into India's green pivot. Well, the big focus is on non-fossil fuel energy capacity of 500 gigawatts by 2030. Also, reduction of CO2 emissions and a 45% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030 as well. The mission innovation, which was launched by the government, is to fasten the clean energy transition. This as India really is leading the way as far as a shift to and transition from fossil fuels is concerned, and a shift to non-renewable energy and cleaner and greener energy is concerned. If we talk about budget 2024, well, the net zero target was clearly in focus. The interim budget highlighted the green growth and a special fund allocation was made to the green energy sector. The thrust, however, was on rooftop solarization, because 1 crore households, as per the interim budget, will get free electricity every month, based on this special fund allocation. Also, a special fund to support economically viable projects, because the bid is to diversify the renewable energy portfolio and reduce the dependence on fossil fuels. This, as India, of course, is also emerging as a big pioneer and a big change maker as far as green hydrogen production is concerned. But while India walks the talk on net zero emissions, what about coal? Because that remains a key consideration. India, of course, is heavily dependent on coal for its energy requirements. Coal makes up for 75% of energy generated in India for coal, as far as energy production is concerned. Coal accounts for 50% of India's power capacity, and the government has no plans of shutting down any coal plants or moving away from coal. So, of course, that remains a key concern. But this, of course, as I said, India is walking the talk as far as clean energy is concerned. And joining me on the broadcast now, I'm being joined by very special guests, Subramaniam Pulipaka and R.R. Rashmi will be joining us on the broadcast. But first, let's listen to what the Prime Minister had to say on net zero emissions at the National Council meet.
भारत 2070 तक नेट जीरो के लक्ष्य को हासिल करने के लिए भी नीतियां बना रहा है। इसका अर्थ है कि आने वाले समय में हमारे देश में अनगिनत ग्रीन जॉब्स बनेगी। आज ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन से जुड़े अभियान और सोलर रूफटॉप मिशन के कारण देश रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी के क्षेत्र में भी तेजी से आगे बढ़ रहा है।
And joining me now, Subramaniam Pulipaka, who is the CEO of the National Solar Energy Federation of India. Also with me, R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow at TERI and former Special Secretary at the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us on the broadcast this evening. Going across to you first, Mr. R.R. Rashmi, how do you see, India's commitment to net zero emissions? Of course, the Prime Minister has said that we are right on track. What do you think should be some of the key focus areas right now as far as the net zero target is concerned?
Thank you very much for getting me on your show. India's total emission at the moment is around 2.8 billion tons per year, which means if we have to bring it down to zero by 2070, we have to decarbonize a number of sectors, plus introduce energy transition technologies, and also modify our current production systems and distribution systems. So this is indeed a very challenging task. But there are positive steps already being taken by the government, at least as far as the electricity generation capacity is concerned. The progress is very, very good, very positive. 170 gigawatts have already been, capacity has been created. But the real difficulty lies in actually scaling up the generation of the electricity and from renewable energy and feeding into the grid. So grid integration of solar energy, the solar, wind and renewable energy is still a tough task, despite the very positive progress made here.
Absolutely. That's a very important point you're making there, Mr. Rashmi, that, to sort of match the demand levels, because of course the demand is much higher than what we're able to sort of generate, as you said, as far as using clean energy is concerned. Mr. Pulipaka, weigh in on that. How do we, employ or utilize clean energy to create or generate more electricity and move away from fossil fuels? Because that, of course, remains to be a very challenging task.
Thank you very much, Vedang. I think, as Mr. Rashmi mentioned, India has been making some phenomenal strides in integrating renewable energy into the grid. But one of the key challenges for renewable energy always remains that it is intermittent. And to scale up the generation sources to meet our demand, both in the peak hours, which are not necessarily the hours where sunlight is available or wind resources available, is a key challenge. But we found a very good solution for that. Government of India early last year announced a new innovative way of bidding renewable energy. We now call it as a firm dispatchable renewable energy, where instead of installing a plain vanilla solar or wind plants, now the bids are being called for energy generation to match the demand curve of utility or an off-taker. So renewable energy companies now have option to install solar plus wind plus energy storage technologies, not just limited to battery storage, pump storage. And we are also looking at the emergence of new technologies and some indigenous technologies like CSP storage. So
Yes.
while we have a huge target ahead of 2030, which is almost 500 gigawatt of renewable energy, and our 2070 net zero targets warrant us to have at least 4,000 to 5,000 gigawatt of solar.
Yes.
So storage will play a very important role there.
And as you said, India is also looking to diversify its, renewable energy portfolio. And that is very interesting, whether it is, solar energy, wind energy. Of course, India is really sort of emerging as a leader in green hydrogen as well. How important is this diversification, Mr. Rashmi?
Absolutely. Very important, because India's energy demand is still rising. We are on the rising curve. So we have to exploit all possible sources of energy to meet this increasing demand. And solar and wind are extremely critical because the renewable energy portfolio has to be scaled up to the extent which our colleague has just mentioned. But in addition, we have to depend on other sources as well, the conventional sources like coal, nuclear, hydro, because there is another segment of economy where currently we don't have technologies to replace the conventional fuels at this moment. For example, industry and transport. The heat-intensive industries like steel, cement, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, and the transport, which is short distance or long distance transport, which is dependent on molecules and fuels. So we have to find alternative fuels here. Prime Minister was mentioning about the green hydrogen, but green hydrogen capacity that we are aiming at by 2030 of 5 million tons of green hydrogen, that itself will not be enough to make the energy transition in the industrial sector. We have to meet the increasing energy demand and at the same time also decarbonize these industries. So we have to invest very heavily in new technologies like green hydrogen, green ammonia, methanol, and possibly the CNG and things like that to be able to make transition in these sectors. So
Absolutely.
this
And
is
you
a
spoke about
challenging
carbon.
task.
Carbon, of course, seems to be a key focus area. Mr. Pulipaka, would you agree that carbon, in a sense, would prove to be a game changer?
Yeah, of course. If you look at the trend of Indian government policies, one thing we have to appreciate it is the way an integrated approach is being followed. For us to achieve our net zero goals, or as a matter of fact, to achieve energy transition, you have four critical sectors that need to be decarbonized: electricity, mobility, industry, and agriculture. So we are now looking at a trend where the government is coming out with various provisions to support each of this sector in their journey to decarbonize. The carbon markets in India are today at a very nascent stage, but it is not an understatement when I say that the world is looking at India's carbon markets. We have seen a couple of good announcements in the last budget, which is the provisions are helping industries to switch over to renewable energy generation technologies and promote energy efficiency while giving them benefits through the carbon market. So I think while, like I said, we are at a very nascent stage, very soon I see India's carbon market becoming the hub of the global narrative or dialogue surrounding the carbon dialogue.
Okay, that's interesting. And also, Mr. Rashmi, looking at coal, because that is a point of contention, because India is heavily dependent on coal for its energy requirements, and the government doesn't seem to have any plan to shut down coal plants as well. So how do you see India sort of reducing its dependence on coal? Because that is going to be critical if we intend to transition completely from fossil fuels.
No, certainly we have to move away from coal in the long term and in due course. But it doesn't mean that we have to stop coal production or coal-fired electricity immediately. India is a developing country, and we have to depend on all possible fuels to be able to meet our energy demand, and coal is one of them. The other developed countries which have reached the present level of energy production and consumption, they haven't reached without fossil fuels. So it doesn't mean that we will move, we should, for moving towards net zero, we should stop all coal-fired electricity immediately. It only means that once we reach a peak, and we don't know when we are going to reach that peak to be able to meet our energy demand and still decarbonize the industry, that's still about 15, 20 years ago. But the good thing is that the coal-fired electricity as a share of total electricity production has already stabilized. It's not rising. After 2016, it has not risen any further.
Yes.
Although the total absolute quantum may still be increasing.
That's a very important
That is because
point.
India's energy demand is increasing.
Yes.
But so we need to have a long-term plan, but we need to take a balanced view here. The renewable energy must rise in the system to be able to replace coal.
Absolutely. So, a pragmatic and balanced approach is important, as you said. But let me also expand the conversation now to how India is, in a sense, walking the talk and leading the way globally and emerging as, the voice of the global South, Mr. Pulipaka. At the COP28 summit as well, the Prime Minister sort of said that the West has to be held accountable as well, because as the Prime Minister said, the West has exploited nature and the developing nations have to bear the brunt of it. So do you see India sort of pushing the global South's agenda as well at global fora like the COP28?
I think today, in most of the senses, India is the flag bearer of the global South, and India is also the flag bearer of equitable and just transition. If you look at the per capita emissions, we are nowhere in the top 10 countries that that have the per capita emissions higher. India, irrespective of being accused of all these things of having more coal or not talking about phasing down coal by many countries, we are the only country which has in the G20 countries which has met its NDCs. We are the fourth largest renewable energy market in the world. We are fifth largest in terms of installed solar capacity. We are going to become the second largest hub for solar manufacturing, and we have ambitious targets. So while India is on one hand increasing its domestic capabilities and demonstrating to the developing world how energy transition can be achieved, India is also sending a message to the developed world that they have a lot of responsibility in not just ensuring affordable and accessible finance is available, but in ensuring that the equitable transition is achieved.
Yes,
today,
and climate equity, of course, seems to be the buzzword as well, particularly after the COP28. And Mr. Rashmi, do you see climate equity in a sense materializing on the ground? Because even after the approval of the Loss and Damage Fund, which of course was a big deal, the fact is that it's still the global South nations and the developing countries that really have to bear the brunt of the damage unleashed by Western nations.
Indeed, equity is a very important principle as far as climate actions are concerned. Unfortunately, the developed countries are not paying enough heed to this principle, despite the fact that the Paris Agreement is built on this foundation. UNFCCC, the International Convention, Mother Convention, is built on this principle. But the actions of the developed countries, our developed country partners, are not in accordance with this principle.
Yes.
They haven't reduced their emissions and the burden is shifting on to the developing countries where the emissions are rising now. So unfortunately, the entire focus has shifted from historical and cumulative emissions to current emissions.
Absolutely.
And India is a large country. India is bound to have a large share in the current emissions, although in terms of cumulative emissions, we are just 4% of the global emissions.
And of course, being the most populous country as well, the demand is certainly much higher as well. So, those...
Yes, it's very natural. It's very natural. But unfortunately, this debate is shifting. The basic fundamental principle itself is being given a go by.
Yes.
But nonetheless, the India as a large country, as a responsible country, has to increase its ambition and participate
and
in the global
accountability
effort.
has to be fixed, as you said earlier as well. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us on this very important debate. India walking the talk on its commitment to net zero emissions.